The night started with the sound of laughter. A group of close friends tucked away in a house far from prying eyes, ready to share stories, snacks, and secrets under the cover of darkness. It was supposed to be a harmless night of fun, a sleepover like any other. But as the hours crept by, so did something else. It began with a subtle knock, faint and almost ignorable. Probably the wind, they said. But the knock came again, and again, until it became impossible to dismiss. What would you do if something stood outside your window, waiting to be invited in? At first, they joked, calling it a prank. They had no idea that by morning, they'd be wishing it was. What if the house you're in has secrets it was never meant to share? What if the friendly faces you trust hold truths they're too scared to speak aloud? They thought they were alone that night. They thought nothing could harm them. They were wrong. Dead wrong. The house sat on the edge of a forgotten countryside road, surrounded by dense woods that seemed to press in closer as the night deepened. The wind roared outside, rattling the thin wooden windows as though warning them to leave. Inside, the living room glowed faintly, its warmth dimmed by the storm outside. Candles flickered on a low table, their light stretching the shadows across the walls into shapes that seemed to move on their own. The group of 4 friends, Emma, Grace, Liam, and Alex, had gathered here for one reason: to create memories. Emma's parents were out of town, leaving the old house entirely to them. It was the perfect setting for a sleepover. They were armed with snacks, blankets, and a shared determination to stay awake all night, swapping ghost stories and daring each other to be braver than the rest. Grace was the loudest of the group, the kind who always needed to take charge. Liam, ever the skeptic, rolled his eyes at her dramatic stories, while Alex's nervous laughter revealed he wasn't as brave as he pretended to be. But it was Emma who stood apart, quieter than the others. Her eyes lingered too long on the darkened hallway, and she flinched every time the wind slammed into the house. She told herself it was just the storm, just her imagination, but a knot of unease had settled in her stomach the moment the sun dipped below the horizon. "All right, enough of the boring stuff," Grace declared, plopping down in the center of the room. She pulled out an old board from her bag, a Ouija board she'd found at a thrift shop earlier that week. Emma hesitated, her voice uncertain. "Are you sure about this? It's just a game, right?" Grace smirked. "Of course it's a game, unless you're scared." The boys laughed, and not wanting to seem like the odd one out, Emma forced herself to smile and nodded. But deep down, she wished they hadn't brought the board at all. The first few minutes were filled with nervous giggles and exaggerated questions. "Who here is going to fail the math test?" Liam joked, moving the planchette himself to spell out Grace. Everyone laughed, but then, as the candles flickered and the wind outside grew louder, the mood began to shift. The room felt colder somehow, the air heavier. And when Alex asked, "Is anyone here with us?" the planchette moved. Not one of their hands pushing it, but gliding slowly, deliberately, toward the word yes. They froze. No one laughed this time. Emma's heart pounded in her chest, and for a moment, no one spoke. Then Grace, ever the bold one, leaned closer. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice almost challenging. The board's response was slower this time, but no less clear. One letter at a time, it spelled out. "Knock." The group stared at one another, confused. "Knock?" Liam said, breaking the silence. "What does that even mean?" And as if on cue, a single knock echoed from the front door. Slow, hollow, impossible. No one moved. The knock came again, this time sharper, louder, like it was daring them to answer. The group exchanged uneasy glances, their laughter now a distant memory. "It's probably the wind," Liam said, his voice betraying a hint of uncertainty. Grace, trying to lighten the mood, smirked and added, "Or maybe your secret admirer, Liam." But her joke fell flat. No one laughed. Emma's hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the candles on the table. The flames danced wildly, as though reacting to something unseen. She didn't want to admit it, but the air in the room felt different, thick, almost suffocating. Grace leaned forward again, gripping the planchette. "Let's keep going," she said, her tone defiant. "Who knocked?" she asked the board. The planchette moved slowly, the sound of their fingers dragging against the board unnervingly loud in the silence. It spelled out a single word. "Here." "This is stupid," Alex muttered, shoving himself back from the table. He stood and walked toward the window. "See? There's nothing out there," he said, gesturing toward the darkness beyond the glass. But then he froze, his breath catching in his throat. "Wait, did you hear that?" The room fell silent. Faintly from outside came the unmistakable sound of footsteps crunching on the gravel driveway. Slow, measured, coming closer. "It's probably just an animal," Grace said, though her voice had lost its usual confidence. But then the sound stopped, right below the window. Everyone held their breath, eyes locked on Alex as he stared into the blackness beyond the glass. Suddenly, a sharp tap, tap, tap echoed against the window. Alex stumbled back, nearly tripping over the rug. "Okay, that's not funny," he snapped, looking at Grace, assuming she was behind it. But Grace shook her head, her face pale. "That wasn't me." The group huddled closer together, their bravado fading as the storm outside seemed to grow louder. The sound of wind mingled with faint creaks from the old house, each one setting their nerves on edge. And then, the first phone buzzed. It was Liam's. He grabbed it quickly, expecting a message from one of their other friends, but his hand froze as he read the screen. The words on the message were garbled, almost nonsensical, but one phrase stood out: "Don't open the door." "What the hell?" Liam muttered, showing the others. Grace laughed nervously. That's just a coincidence, right? A prank text?" But then Alex's phone buzzed too. This time it wasn't a message. It was a voice note, distorted and scratchy, like it had been recorded underwater. The voice on the recording whispered faintly, but it was clear enough to send chills down their spines. "It's already inside." The lights flickered suddenly, casting the room into shadow for a brief second before coming back on. The group jumped, their breaths coming faster now. Emma spoke up, her voice shaking. Maybe we should just stop. Call someone. My parents..." But before she could finish, the lights went out entirely, plunging the house into darkness. The only light now came from the faint glow of their phones and the weak flicker of the remaining candles. Grace grabbed a flashlight from her bag, her hands trembling. "Okay," she said, trying to sound brave. "I'll check the window. This is ridiculous." The others protested, but Grace was already moving toward the sound of the knocking. Slowly, cautiously, she approached the window. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the glass and the faint outline of nothing. No one was there. Relief washed over her, but it was short-lived. As she turned the flashlight downward, the beam caught something on the ground outside, a trail of muddy footprints leading away from the window. The strange part? The footprints didn't lead toward the house. They led outward, into the woods, as though whatever had been there wasn't human. Grace stumbled back, slamming the curtains shut. "We need to lock the doors," she whispered, her voice barely audible. But the real question lingered in the air, unspoken. What if it was already too late? Panic was setting in. The group huddled in the dim glow of their flashlights, their breath visible in the frigid air that had somehow crept into the room. Every sound, every creak of the old house, felt amplified, oppressive. They agreed to check the doors and windows to ensure everything was locked. But as fear took hold, their resolve wavered, and splitting up seemed like the only way to cover the house quickly. They promised to stay in constant contact, their phones clutched tightly in their trembling hands. Emma stayed in the living room, her eyes darting between the boarded-up window and the flickering candles on the table. She couldn't take her eyes off the Ouija board, now abandoned, but somehow radiating menace. Meanwhile, Grace made her way to the kitchen, the floorboards groaning beneath her cautious steps. Liam and Alex moved upstairs, their flashlights casting shaky beams of light onto the peeling wallpaper and closed doors. Liam was the first to notice something unusual. At the end of the upstairs hallway, a faint mist seemed to cling to the air. He followed it to the bathroom, where he found the mirror fogged over, as though someone had taken a hot shower, despite the freezing temperature in the house. Wiping the glass with his sleeve, he froze. There, in uneven, jagged letters, a single word was scrawled across the mirror: leave. His stomach turned as the word slowly began to fade on its own, as if it was never there. He stumbled backward, knocking into Alex, who had just emerged from one of the bedrooms. "What happened?" Alex asked, but Liam could only point toward the mirror, now perfectly clean. Alex shook his head, trying to dismiss the fear growing inside him. "Let's just check the rest of the rooms," he said, though his voice wavered. Back in the kitchen, Grace was searching for anything she could use to barricade the doors. She set her flashlight on the counter, its beam angled toward the window. That's when she saw it, a faint reflection in the glass, a shadowy figure, standing motionless behind her. Her breath hitched, and she spun around, the light trembling in her grip. But there was no one there. The kitchen was empty, or so it seemed. When she turned back to the window, the figure was gone, replaced by her own pale, terrified reflection. She screamed, dropping the flashlight, and bolted back to the living room. Emma heard the scream and gripped the edge of the table. "Grace?" she called out, her voice cracking. The Ouija board shifted suddenly, the planchette moving on its own. It slid quickly across the letters, spelling out two chilling words: "Not alone." Emma's throat tightened as the planchette shot across the board again, this time landing on a single letter: B. Before it could finish its message, the candles extinguished in unison, plunging the room into complete darkness. By now, Liam and Alex were making their way back downstairs, the eerie silence of the house broken only by the sound of their own footsteps. "Did you see that?" Liam whispered, pausing at the top of the staircase. Alex shook his head, confused. "See what?" Liam pointed to the attic door above them, which now hung slightly ajar. It hadn't been opened before. "We didn't go up there," Alex muttered, his voice barely audible. Against their better judgment, they climbed the narrow staircase to the attic. The air was colder here, and the faint smell of mildew mixed with something sharper, something metallic. As their flashlights swept across the cluttered space, they froze. In the center of the room were their belongings: Emma's scarf, Grace's water bottle, Alex's backpack, arranged neatly, as if someone had been keeping them there all along. But that wasn't the worst part. The items weren't covered in dust like the rest of the attic. They were fresh, as if they had just been placed there. Before they could react, Alex's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and stared at the screen, his face draining of color. It was a text message from an unknown number. It read, "Too late." He turned to show Liam, but Liam was gone. One moment he had been standing right beside him, and the next, the only sign of him was his flashlight, lying on the floor, its beam cutting through the shadows. Alex called out, his voice breaking, "Liam, this isn't funny." But the only answer was the creak of the attic floorboards behind him. Emma and Grace stumbled into the hallway, their faces pale and their breaths ragged. "Where are Liam and Alex?" Grace whispered, clutching Emma's arm as if letting go would mean losing herself too. The storm outside had reached a deafening roar, and the walls of the old house seemed to groan under its force. Shadows danced in the faint flicker of Emma's flashlight, and every creak of the floor felt like a warning. "We need to leave," Emma said, her voice trembling. But as they turned toward the front door, Grace's eyes caught something hanging on the wall. A picture frame, tilted slightly, as though it had been touched recently. "Wait," Grace muttered, stepping closer. Her hand hesitated before reaching for the frame, her fingers trembling as she pulled it down. Behind it was a small hole in the wall, just big enough to fit a notebook. The leather-bound diary was worn, its pages yellowed with age, Grace flipped through it, her breathing shallow as she read the hurried, frantic entries. "It's a record," she whispered, "from someone who used to live here." The words were barely legible, scrawled in uneven lines. "The knocking won't stop. They want me to open the door, but I won't. I won't." Another entry read, "They took her. I told her not to look outside, but she didn't listen." Grace turned the page, and both girls froze. There, pressed between the pages, was a faded photograph of a group of children. 4 smiling faces stared back at them, but one of the faces made Emma's blood run cold. It was Liam. "This can't be," Emma whispered, stepping back, the flashlight shaking in her hands. Grace's lips trembled, her voice barely audible. "It's him. It's Liam." They looked at each other, panic rising. The photo was dated 20 years ago. The implication was horrifying. Whatever was happening in the house, it wasn't new. It had happened before, and now it was happening again. Desperation gripped them as they scrambled toward the front door, their feet slipping on the old wooden floor. Emma yanked at the lock, her hands shaking so badly that it took her 3 tries to pull the door open. The cold night air hit them like a slap, but they didn't care. They ran into the storm, their flashlights bobbing wildly as they stumbled down the driveway and onto the dirt road leading away from the house. When they reached the edge of the woods, Emma stopped and turned back. The house loomed in the distance, its silhouette barely visible through the rain. For a moment, she thought she saw a figure standing in the attic window, watching them. She blinked, and it was gone. Grace tugged at her arm. "Come on, Emma. We have to go." They didn't stop running until the house was far behind them. By dawn, they had reached the nearest neighbor, a kind old woman who let them in and called the police. But when the authorities arrived at the house, they found no trace of Liam or Alex. The attic was empty, the belongings they'd seen so clearly the night before nowhere to be found. The police dismissed their story as a combination of fear and imagination. But Emma and Grace knew better. The diary, the photograph, the knocking, they couldn't explain it. But they knew it was real. Weeks passed. Emma and Grace tried to move on, though the weight of that night hung over them like a shadow. Liam and Alex's families organized searches, put up missing posters, and begged for answers, but none came. Then, one night, Liam's parents received a text message from his phone. It was brief, just 3 words. "I'm still here." The message came from an unknown location, one that couldn't be traced, but the phone was off, or at least it should have been. It had been found in the attic, lying in a pile of dust. To this day, the house remains abandoned, its windows boarded up and its secrets buried. But some say that on stormy nights, if you listen closely, you can still hear the faint sound of knocking. And if you dare to look outside, you might just see footprints leading into the woods. But be careful, because if you hear that knock, it might already be too late. Emma and Grace survived the night, but they could never truly escape what happened in that house. The echoes of the knocking, the chilling words scrawled in the mirror, and the faces in that photograph followed them like shadows. They tried to forget, to convince themselves it was over, but deep down, they knew. Some nightmares never let go, and sometimes the scariest part is not knowing if it's truly the end. What would you have done if you were in their place? Would you have answered the knock or left before it was too late? Let us know in the comments below. We want to hear your thoughts on this chilling story. If this story sent a chill down your spine, don't forget to hit the like button. And if you want more terrifying tales that will keep you awake at night, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications. We'll see you next time.